G'day folks, my name is Rob. Welcome back to another F1 fantasy video. Today we are looking at my team selection for the Hungarian Grand Prix. So if you're new around here, be sure to drop a like on the video and subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. We'll take a quick look at how all things shook out in Silverstone. 152 points for the weekend. Went into the weekend with a couple of different decisions on my mind after a underwhelming Austrian Grand Prix. The intention after free practice was to bring in Mercedes. They looked very strong, and that seemed to transpire in qualifying, with George and Lewis securing a front row lockout. Now, I think heading into the Grand Prix, all very good reasons to be optimistic, even though I didn't suspect George Russell would hold on to pole position and convert that into a win. He ultimately did look very good until he had to retire with a water issue of sorts with his car, which pretty much spelled the end for Mercedes coming out on top for the weekend in terms of constructor points. But Lando Norris did his part, finished in third place on the podium. No driver of the day as expected, because typically whoever finishes ahead of Max or the next best driver usually comes home with that. As we all know, Lewis Hamilton had an absolute blockbuster weekend, coming in P2 in qualifying, winning the race, first result on the top step since Saudi Arabia 2021. So super stoked for Lewis, an incredible result for Mercedes. They've now won 2 races on the trot, and I have no doubt they will continue to build towards more strong results heading into Hungary, Belgium, and beyond the summer break. In terms of the rest of the team, I look to also replace one of the Sauber drivers. Mercedes obviously came in over Red Bull, and that was ultimately decided to be Valtteri Bottas. I thought it was a coin flip on which driver of the two had to leave my team, and was thinking about going for a double B lineup. So Lando Norris, George Russell, and Logan Sargent, or something to that effect. Ultimately opted for the single A, and I suppose in hindsight that worked out. I avoided the George Russell DNF, so that was a plus. But yeah, great result for the Haas drivers. Magnussen led all drivers with overtakes and positions gained. Nico Hülkenberg had a great race, starting P6, finishing P6. And I think everything looked like it was coming to, I guess, a good result for my team after a couple of mixed weekends in Canada, in Spain, and again in Austria. Pierre Gasly starting from the back in a car that looks to be much improved from earlier in the season. Was on for a lot of overtakes and positions gained, but he didn't even make it to the start line. So I felt like the weekend, as soon as Sunday rolled around, was a very stark contrast to the Saturday, where hopes were very much high for what the race could have been. But look, 152 points, not a terrible result. And given I had 2 sets of minus 20 in my team, my rank only went down by about 800 or so spots. So not the worst. I think Gasly and Mercedes were both quite highly owned for people inside the top 10K. But it could have been a lot better. And I think this is potentially one such route I could continue to build a little bit more budget and get closer to running a Lando Norris, Logan Sargent without... Lando Norris, George Russell without Logan Sargent, or Lando Norris, Lewis Hamilton, something like that moving forward, because I do think both of those drivers are the pick of the bunch in terms of F1 fantasy. Now, as usual, want to take a look at a couple of drivers on the watch list for this week. I've got Lewis Hamilton front and center. We saw him have an incredible result again in Silverstone after quite a few results recently that I thought was a sign of things to come. Now, I do think that Lewis has been unlucky a little bit earlier in the season. Mercedes do have a race-winning car, from what it seems at the moment now, and has been in good positions for podiums, which he has managed to secure. But that race win we knew was certainly coming sooner rather than later. I think if you haven't already got him in your team, or at least the Mercedes constructor, which I assume most of you watching this may well have one of, if not both of, he becomes a very attractive candidate. In the last 5 races, he's scored 151 points, so averaging more than 30 points per race weekend. That leads Norris and Verstappen, who are in the 140s, in the last 5 races. So I think his points per race of 18.4 probably isn't reflective of his recent good form. You also throw in the fact that he does typically, as I think I've spoken about before in other videos, qualify slightly worse than his teammate George Russell. So as a result of that, that probably sets him up for the additional position gain, the odd overtakes here and there. We know how good his racecraft and experience is, so that's naturally going to come into effect, particularly in those wetter races, such as Belgium, which tends to have a history of rain coming up on the horizon. I do think as well at 16%, Lewis is extremely low owned. I do think this certainly puts him in the box seat to move your rank further and further ahead if you own him. 16% would be one of the lowest drivers in the game, aside from George Russell, Sergio Perez, etc. So I really like the attractiveness of Lewis there. If you haven't got the Mercedes constructor, I think they're an easy buy or a hold. But if you want to double up on Mercedes coverage, Lewis is by far and away the better of the two drivers, even though he is slightly more expensive than his teammate George Russell. He also has gone up quite a bit in the last 5 races. He's had, let's just check over on F1 Fantasy Tools quickly. Because he has had truly some of the most highest price rises in the last 5 or 6 races. The only driver to have 3 $1 million increases across Monaco to Silverstone, 3.4 over that same span. So you can tell the uplift in Mercedes performance has coincided since Monaco. 3.4 of that 3.5 net increase has come in the last 5 races. So I think Lewis is trending upwards. And after that $1 million increase, now has risen the most among all drivers in the game this season. I don't think that's going to change. I think the Mercedes car is qualifying much better. And we've also seen Ferrari fall back a little bit. So I think another good qualifying performance at a circuit like Hungary, which typically doesn't have quite as many overtakes as some of the other tracks on the calendar do. I do think that if he can put in a very good qualifying result on the Saturday, that'll set him up for another nice 0.3 or $1 million increase moving forward. So, yeah, I really like Lewis, driver of the day as well in Silverstone. He's a fan favorite for a reason. And I do think that, to be honest, that's going to potentially continue. And we know how good and how popular Lando Norris is too. I do suspect that if, McLaren are looking very competitive on Hungary and Lando's on pole or close to it, then he could very well come away with that. And I'm leaning towards holding Lando just because I think, even though Lewis did win it, and I'd say he's probably, if not the most popular, close to second and definitely third in terms of F1 fantasy anyway, for driver of the day, I do think he becomes a very attractive option, certainly if you're able to pair him with a Lando Norris. So I really like Lewis in a rich famous form right now. I definitely think that's going to continue heading into the summer break. Another driver on the watch list is Lance Stroll, and I wouldn't say that's actually for a good reason. Lance has now, as many of you know, entered the B tier at 15.1 million. As F1 Fantasy Tools cracked earlier in the season, drivers are grouped into 3 different tiers. The C tier being anything below 15 million, the B tier being 15 million to 25 million, and the A tier being 25 million plus. Now that Lance has entered the B tier, price increases are not going to be quite as drastic as, say, he would have been in the C tier. I think as well, the fact that the Aston Martin just isn't as competitive as it was 12 months ago makes me think he is a very easy sell if you own him. His point scoring potential just is not that high compared to not just people in the B tier, but even people in the C tier. And even though he did have a solid result in terms of F1 fantasy, his second double-digit points haul in a row, he had 12 in Silverstone, coming off 16 in Austria, and then also had 14 in Canada. I don't think that's explosive enough to warrant owning him in your team. His teammate Fernando Alonso really producing almost identical scores over the last 4 or so races. And I do think when you're spending 15 million on a driver that's not really going to get you more than 15 points, which is pretty much his high of this season, 16 in Austria, you really need to see more production from someone that's not getting quite as many price rises. And you look at the likes of George Russell, look at the likes of even Charles Leclerc, Oscar Piastri, they're naturally going to score more points than Lance Stroll, even if it is an extra 5 to 7 million more. So I just don't see the value in owning Lance Stroll when you look at all of the statistics on screen. Yes, he doesn't have a great qualifying record in some cases, so that may set him up for a few extra overtakes and positions gained, which is both categories he has performed very well in this season, but I don't think that's enough to justify owning him now that he's in the B tier. So if you own Lance Stroll, I would definitely sell him ahead of Hungary. So I want to quickly look at some team selection dilemmas heading into the next Grand Prix. And single A, A and B, or double B is probably the approach many of you are thinking of. The single A for me is the Lando Norris and 4 strong midfield tier C drivers, which is what I currently have at the moment. I do have six or so million sitting in spare cost cap on the side, so I definitely want to soak that up in Hungary, and a potential 2 trades would certainly be able to do that. You could also, if you have enough budget, approach Hungarian Grand Prix with an A and B, so a Lando Norris and a Lewis Hamilton, or a Lando Norris and a George Russell. I really like that. Or you could go for the double B, so a Lewis Hamilton and Oscar Piastri, Lewis Hamilton and George Russell, etc., etc. So I think they're probably the most popular combinations. We know Max Verstappen, even though he is very reliable, probably won't have the same explosive potential compared to the rest of the drivers in the top 4, top 5 that we might otherwise see from him on a sprint race weekend. The next one isn't until Circuit of the Americas later in the year, so I think it very much makes Max obsolete in our fantasy teams for now. In terms of constructors, I think many of you are running two of Mercedes, McLaren, and Red Bull. I think Red Bull's pit stop points certainly keep them in the fight. We saw that in Silverstone alone. Perez has been a non-factor, and I think what certainly makes that a less attractive constructor is the fact that they are the most likely team of the top 4 teams, in my opinion, for a driver to go out before Q3 and lose points for qualifying as a result. I'd say Ferrari isn't that much further off, though. I do think we will see both Ferrari drivers inside the top 10, but we saw Charles Leclerc fail to make it into Q3 in Silverstone, and they certainly have more of a habit of doing that than McLaren and Mercedes this season. So I very much think McLaren and Mercedes are ready-made to go into our teams. Sure, I think you're getting the pit stop points from Red Bull, and all you need is a top 10 finish from Perez to make that constructor slightly more appealing than what it currently is. But the fact that they bagged 15 pit stop points in Silverstone, I definitely expect 10 minimum, 8 to 10 minimum per week is usually on the cards for them. So if that can soak up whatever Perez's poor performance negates, I do think it's going to be pretty even. But again, you've also got to take into consideration the fact that Red Bull is 5 to 6 more million than Mercedes. So what can you do with that extra 5 to 6 million? You could probably upgrade your midfield drivers or something like that from a Zhou to a Pierre Gasly or a Hülkenberg or a Magnussen. So I do think Ferrari are becoming very idle now in terms of the more engaged strategists in the game. You look at the leaderboards for global leagues, most of them own Mercedes and McLaren. For driver of the day, I already talked about that, but I do think whoever finishes behind Max Verstappen, should he win the race, is the odds-on favourite to secure the driver of the day. Or if you look at Lewis Hamilton in Silverstone, he's likely the candidate to win that. I do think Lando Norris probably was in the box seat for a win had McLaren not absolutely butchered his race strategy. And I do think that if we see a bit more consistency from McLaren, then I do think that theme of him winning driver of the day will continue. But nothing to overlook with Lewis, an extremely popular driver as well. The Mercedes certainly is surging at the moment, and I wouldn't be surprised if we see a driver of the day win from George Russell or Lewis Hamilton anytime soon. So I do like that for the case of running an AB or a double B lineup in the next few races. In terms of my team for Hungary, very early team thoughts, I know, but I have talked about the possibility of running a double B or an AB. The most obvious and easiest route to getting that would be George Russell and Logan Sargent. Now, I've talked about how bad an asset Logan Sargent is. He's just leaking value. He's gone down in price from his starting season price, and pairing that with Zhou, who also came away with negative points in Silverstone, -2. He's really not showing anything and hasn't since the first 5 or 6 races of the season. It's just not great points per million value. You're seeing net 0 points over the last couple of weeks and 10 in the last 4 races. So 12 in the last 5. So he's leaking just as much value as Sauber, and you could almost classify the Saubers as a more expensive Logan Sargent in terms of fantasy production and price gain or price loss variance. So I'm not so sure if I want to do this. I think the point ceiling is there for Lando Norris, George Russell, Hülkenberg, but you are expected to probably lose some value. And I may not have the ability to afford this lineup in the next few races because George Russell's 0.5 million increase isn't going to happen again anytime soon, in my opinion. So I could certainly run one such approach. The other would be to keep K-Mag in the team, as I said, an absolute magnet for overtakes and positions gained. There's a lot of money sitting on the side, and I had Pierre Gasly here. I think he's extremely viable to run one more race or however many races, but I think this lineup for 4 reliable C tiers would probably set my team up for a wild card soon once I can afford an AB or a double B lineup. So Esteban Ocon could slot in there. I could go for Yuki Tsunoda. That's pretty much it in terms of what I can afford for the remaining C tiers. So very reliable, I would say. It is a bit of DNF roulette because the midfield and back marker teams are more than likely to DNF. I don't know why, but I feel like Sauber is due a DNF soon. We haven't seen anything from either driver lately. I just suspect there's something that's bound to go wrong for them soon at the back of the pack. So I could potentially roll one extra trade into Hungary, and then, if there's enough budget gain to be had, could easily swap out these 3 for an AB like a George Russell, Lando Norris or something like that. But all very much early thoughts at the moment. And I do think that my team could well roll into a wild card post-summer break. I think if I can get the makings of this team a couple more races, then I think it could look good. The only thing I will say is Belgium is the race after Hungary. Max Verstappen may well end up taking a grid penalty for a new power unit component, which would be his 4th of the season. So just monitor that. He could be very much in the box seat for overtakes and positions gained if he starts at the back. Belgium is a high overtake track. So I could well roll my team up into budget building for one more week, wildcard into a Verstappen lineup with enough flexibility to move into a Lando Norris, George Russell lineup in 2 trades, something like that. But anyway, that is food for thought for now. I will be back with my race week preview and final thoughts closer to the deadline. But as always, guys, appreciate you watching, and I'll see you all very soon.